So welcome everybody.
Hi, how are you?
Hello.
So my name is Jean-Paul O'Brien. I'm here in Boulder, Colorado, and I'm super excited to be presenting today on a topic that is controversial, but it's amazingly growing right now. There's a new industry, so we're going to be talking about this emerging industry of psychedelic medicines. One of the things that I've thought about over time here, and actually I'm going to tell you a little story when I can here. Let's see, I'm going to pop up, bring in a little bit of a, it was just a couple weeks ago, and my daughter, who is a freshman in college, came up to me and said, can you guys see that?
It's blurry.
Yeah, let me re-add it.
Something went away.
Yeah, I'm going to re-add it. Hold on. This was really amazing. So 2 weeks ago, we had my daughter came up to me and said, "Hey, this is I just got this on my Apple phone," which was literally an advertisement from News Plus from Apple saying, "Hey, is psychedelics and hallucinating going to be a new medicine?" And what was surprising to me was while we've been tracking this industry over the past 24 months or so, especially in human tech, all of a sudden, every single person who has an iPhone out there literally got almost a shocking, provocative, amazing looking, message in front of them. And not just people who are in business, but my family members, my dad, who's in his 70s, my daughter, who's 18. And so what's amazing to me is right now, what is going on? And so we really wanted to engage the four of us to really talk about what are the mediums and what's the opportunity here for, very specifically, when we look at the growing industry of medicine, and specifically psychedelic inspired medicine. So my name is JP O'Brien. I'm the founder and CEO of Black Ops Sports. Welcome everybody. I'm going to be your moderator. I'm excited to invite in the other three panelists. And Seth, we're going to keep you minimized on your screen just so that the recording gets all four of us on there.
Oh, sorry. I thought that was just on my end. I was doing it so I wasn't looking in the wrong direction. That's funny. Sorry.
It's a whole new world, right? We are, and so what I want to do is I want each of you to kind of introduce yourselves a little bit, but I'm going to start with Christian, if you don't mind. So Christian is a social serial entrepreneur and investor, one of the largest investors in the UK and in Europe, doing a lot of work in fintech and also in life sciences and a lot of other areas. But Christian, you introduce yourself, but also hit on this conversation because you just recently, in the last few weeks, got a big investment from Peter Thiel, did you not?
We did for ATAI, which is one of my companies and deep psychedelic company. So quick introduction. Hello, everybody. I'm Christian, as I said. I'm German and living in London. You might hear the accent still a little bit, or maybe a lot. I run my own family office. I started in biotech, actually, although I'm not a scientist. I was super young and I had a lot of luck because my two tutors at uni, looking back, hindsight, had made an amazing innovation, and I was a little bit co-writing sort of that success very early on, which means I dropped out of uni. I practically was never really there. And since then, actually, so since the age of 20, I'm investing in mainly, if you simplify, because ultimately I always did what makes me happy and what interests me, but like simplified and structured, I did a lot of I still do biotech, which is actually my number one sector. Then fintech, insurtech, proptech, and crypto as the second biggest sector. And then increasingly a lot, actually, what we call deep tech, like space tech, AI, cybersecurity, all the fancy stuff. So that's my world. We do everything from earlier stage to later stage, listed stuff, and then we do psychedelics. So that's ATAI. So I'm sort of somewhat, maybe that's also important for ATAI. Like I'm sort of somewhat between an investor and founder still myself, meaning I started as a founder, grew into a family office. So we're investing our own capital. But once in a while, we do see, by luck, by whatever, ideas where we either really think we do it better than, or we could potentially do it better than anybody else, or how it was with psychedelics, we literally were the first psychedelic company in the world. So when I actually had sort of the epiphany myself by doing a psychedelic trip, I was like, well, this should be available. Like then I was looking around and there was no company back then. So I started the first one.
Awesome. Well, welcome. And then JR, I'd love for you to introduce yourself. You started at Uber, if I'm not mistaken, and then was a Y Combinator company, upgraded,
correct,
right?
Yeah.
And then you are, speaking of first, you're the first public company that's in the psychedelic medicine space. Is that true?
That's right. Yeah, we are the first public psychedelic pharmaceutical company in Canada. We listed on the NEO exchange back in. Let's see now. This whole time thing is really when you're sitting around in isolation, you start to lose track of time. It was March 3rd, so. We took the company public, but ultimately I'm an entrepreneur. I come out of similar worlds like Christian, out of the tech space. And what I was ultimately seeing in Silicon Valley was that a lot of my friends were going to put a lot of people out of work. And I think there's, in the past, tech has always been default positive. There were no negative externalities. And I think we're starting to see now that AI and automation, I believe there was a Deloitte or McKinsey report that said 800 million people are going to lose their job by 2030. So to me, that was like, wow, that's a huge problem. And I was looking at my friend who had just started, a self-driving truck company at Y Combinator and, like self-serving barista machines and going, where is everybody going to work? Because when people don't have jobs, mental health and addiction skyrocket out of control. And so that was my thesis 2 years ago, and that was really the problem. I was starting with a problem and ultimately wanted to end with an impact when setting up this company. What I've really sort of found in the last month and a half is that everything that I was thinking about, these 800 million people that were going to lose their job globally, that all just got fast forwarded. We've lost 30 million jobs in America in the last month. This is going to have a profound impact on our mental health and addiction. And I think we are in, really the Great Depression of mental health and addiction. And I think there's going to need to be far more companies just like Christian and I's that are going to solve these problems. This is a massive market. There are tons of problems, tons of indications. And, I'm happy that we can sit here and have a discourse on how we create disruptive technologies for these problems.
Great. Well, we'll get back to that in just a minute. That's pretty exciting. So Seth, please introduce yourself. Seth, everyone, is one of the co-founders and partners at Foundry Group, which is a venture firm here in Boulder. And Seth, I was just going to go down a list of a few of the companies that you have invested in over time when I was looking through it. Pretty amazing. Companies like Fitbit and Sphero and Whoop. So Fitbit revolutionizing and kind of leading the way in activity trackers, Whoop now into personalized performance and sleep, Nima in the food, gluten, and type of testing area, a Molecule, June. So all these companies seem to be leaders or first in kind of pushing some of the industry. Love to have you introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your firm.
Sure. Well, hi everyone. I'm Seth. So about 12 years ago, I started a venture firm here in Boulder, Colorado, called Foundry Group with 3 other guys. Fast forward 12 years later, we manage about $2.5 billion, and we invest primarily in Series A opportunities. JP listed a handful of them. There's probably maybe 100 companies in the history of Foundry, so there's quite a few more. But more recently, in the last 3 or 4 years, we've started also investing in other venture funds. So we've got 37 venture funds that we've invested in sort of a fund of funds model. So we've got we're also the biggest investor in Techstars, which is a global accelerator program. And then just personally, we've had sort of this kind of side investment practice. It used to do funds. Now we can't do that because the main fund does funds, but also invests in a handful of companies. And sort of the combination of all of that is probably a look through into somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000 underlying businesses. Many of those are Techstars companies because a lot of companies have gone through Techstars, but even just in the 35 venture funds that we invested in and their prior funds, there's 3,000 or 4,000 companies there. So pretty broad platform. And obviously we look for disruptive technologies. When JP mentioned a couple of them, when we invested in Zynga, which wasn't on his list, social gaming didn't exist. When we invested in Fitbit, sort of this idea of tracking human behavior was pretty nascent. It was essentially a pedometer. It was literally a little clip back then. You couldn't even wear it on your wrist. More recently, we invested in Whoop, which is a fitness band. I'm wearing one right now, actually, that tracks strain, stress, and recovery. So we've long been personally interested in from an investment perspective, different ways to understand what's going on with your physical body, and different methods for adapting behavior because of that. And that's not all of those are physical devices. More recently, we invested in a company that we actually haven't announced the investment itself yet, but in a company that's offering virtualized mental health services as an example of just what are different ways that people will interface with their health and their lifestyles, if you will. And I think JR mentioned this, but this is going to change rapidly, I think, as we're now in this kind of new post-COVID-19 period. And I think we're all learning a lot about what does it mean to have a relationship with a practitioner? What does it mean to have social connections? What do we need to do to enable our physical and mental health in a time when we're a little bit more isolated? So I think that people are more and more open now to a different way of thinking about how their lives will be lived and how they access various services and things that are important to them.
Great, thanks, Seth. So, a question for maybe we start with JR and Christian. But so, what is the market here? I mean, if you think about crossing the chasm, Jeffrey Moore's typical piece, idea of a niche market first. It sounds like we're talking about mental health. It sounds like we're talking about like anxiety, but psychedelics is pretty wide in its opportunities. Tell me about what the market is now and what's the niche that you're going after.
Who first?
Up to you. You take it.
Okay. I mean, first of all, unfortunately, it's not a niche. Yeah. So meaning, even if you take sub-indications, the amount of people suffering, depression overall, more than 300 million people suffering. And by the way, any kind of number we're going to pull up, is most likely too low because the whole theme of mental health, or in that case, mental illnesses, is still highly stigmatized. So our internal guess is that any number is sort of too low. Yeah, but even unfortunately, the reported numbers are incredibly high. So it is not a niche, unfortunately. Yeah, and then even if you go down, like for example, we're doing psilocybin, the active ingredient of magic mushrooms, for treatment-resistant depression. That's in drug development often that you pick one, because it goes faster. For example, treatment, I mean, super simplified. I'm not being now very medical, but treatment-resistant depression, meaning these people are really tried everything in a very bad situation. So if you make them better, it's a very obvious, because don't forget, it's not so easy with mental health like with cancer that you can say cancer there, cancer not there. Yeah. So in order to assess the mental health, it's a little bit more like comprehensive. Yeah. So in a certain way, from a drug approval point of view, the more extreme the disease, the easier you can prove the sort of improvement. But then once drugs are approved, then they can be used either off-label or you do post-marketing studies, whatever. Then it's way easier sort of to work your way through other indications.
So what I'm hearing you say, and maybe JR jump on this, is that while there's a lot of broad spectrum as far as the problem solution set, the medical side is the direction. Is that the tip of the spear here? There's no recreational side or any other side. This is all medical?
Look, our focus is on the medicalization and using these substances as medicines. We're a neuropharmaceutical company that happens to be working on substances that are based on psychedelics. What we're really focused on are the problems. I'm less concerned about the substance and more concerned with what is the potential outcome. If you look at if you want to talk about market size, let's talk about addiction in the United States. The opioid crisis costs the U.S. economy $500 billion a year. That's probably understated because we haven't really reached the peak of the amount of folks that are actually eligible for treatments for opioid addiction. But then let's look at the system. I mean, this is a totally broken system. I was part of the system. I developed my own addictions and my own issues with mental health over the years. And if you look at the rehab market, it's $42 billion a year in the United States. And there are estimates that only less than 10% of people that actually need rehab services get it. And so that's a $42 billion a year market. These are big problems and they are not going away. They're going to get worse in isolation after COVID-19. We know from animal models that when rats, for example, there was a study called the rat park model, that addiction increases 19-fold when in isolation. I've been in my apartment for the last month and a half. I think most of you have been in similar circumstances. This is a problem that is going to be profound. And really, I think our companies are working on problems that are going to be part of this recovery as well.
What do you guys think about the government as at least the U.S. government as a potential buyer here? Like, there's some really interesting emerging use cases around PTSD, and sometimes that's a way to kind of, like, you get the military on board, at least in the States, and that's a fast track to more broad acceptance, and in particular regulatory acceptance, which is going to be a bigger issue probably here than it will be in Canada or in Europe.
Yeah, maybe to add, like, I think because your question came also, I mean, there is a lot of, I don't want to controversy, and we discussed it before, like on the one is the for-profit, non-profit, but then the other thing is, should they be medical? Should they be completely legal? Should they go the cannabis way? Yeah. So my view is, if you go through, so first of all, to sort of a little bit additionally what JR said, these are incredibly mighty drugs. Yeah. Mighty in a very positive meaning. But if you go back where they come from, and meaning again, and I'm with JR, so ATAI is, I always say I sort of have both sides. Like ATAI is a professional biotech pharmaceutical company. We want to get drugs approved for medical use. I'm personally extremely spiritual. So I do psychedelics in a region where it's legal, yeah, so in a legal setting, but for really a spiritual, you might call it religious, meaning all these adjectives immediately bring a lot of sort of baggage with them, yeah, but reason. So but if you go back, so I love the history of psychedelics. If you go back in the history, they always have been a drug which has been consumed with a guide, yeah, with a shaman, with a priest. They were never party drugs. They were never intoxicating like alcohol. They were never used for that. They were always used in a religious setting. Yeah. So fast forward, so the guy, the religion of our, the priests of our time, like therapists, whatever. But these are drugs you need somebody for positive reasons. Yeah. Not meaning, I know a lot of people say, oh, you're saying that because it makes it a business model, but it's wrong. Like, if you look into how these drugs work, yeah, they work. It's not like a cancer drug. You say, give the drug and maybe the cancer goes away and maybe it doesn't go away. So there is a prep time. There is what they call setting. Yeah, there is somebody who needs to guide you through the trip, because the trip can be challenging. This is not this is not a party trip. And then there is a post-integration time. So we are even actually working not just on the drugs, but on providing, for example, technological support. Yeah, what we got, again, what JR said, technology is neutral. Technology can do a lot of good. Technology can do a lot of bad. Yeah, in our senses, in our cases, and it will do a lot of good because you can use apps like, because not everybody can afford a therapist all the time. So you can beautifully design the whole, literally, because this is why it's called a trip, the whole journey, to make, and now the important point, at the end, to help people who have a need. So, by the way, as a side note, this is why I think we wouldn't do the world a favor if they were broadly legal as cannabis is, because, by the way, nobody would use it. My favorite example, my unfortunately favorite example, are the Netherlands. You can go to Amsterdam. A lot of people do, but by the way, not a tiny amount of people. That's the misperception. But you can go to Amsterdam, or people in the Netherlands who are depressive would just need to go to the next coffee shop and buy magic mushrooms, but they don't. For one simple reason: if you are depressive, you're not doing that. So I just want to raise a point, because I know a lot of people dial in, and if you would have the conference in physical, like a lot of people would be there. We all are an incredibly privileged group of people. We can sit in Colorado, which I like because I had an amazing trip there, and do that. But like, I can afford to fly to Colorado, have a nice place in Colorado, organize all of that. So but not everybody can. So it is sort of, just if it's medical, we make it available for the people who need it in the setting they need it, and somebody will pay for it, hopefully, if they have healthcare insurance. I know America is a messed up system with healthcare. So in Europe, it's a little bit easier, but the likelihood that somebody pays is hard. But this is why I'm so adamant that this is a medical solution. In parallel, by the way, it should be decriminalized. That's the other point. Like, nobody should go to jail. I think it should. I'm very firm. It should not be legal for selling. But decriminalization, I think, where Colorado is also leading, and Denver should be. Nobody should be in jail for using magic mushrooms at home to dose themselves.
So let me ask you this, just to give our viewers kind of an understanding. Where are we on the timeline? So first company a year and a half ago, first public company March 3rd, right? All these kind of regulations have to happen. All this, where are we literally on the timeline? When are we going to see it at least legal for medical in the U.S., do you think?
I think that's depends on what substance. I think that MAPS is probably closest to an approval for MDMA with PTSD. That Christian could probably tell you otherwise about his companies, but I think there are opportunities for example, MindMed, we are working on opioid withdrawal and opioid use disorder. There are incentives by the government, coming back to Seth's point, how can we leverage a relationship with the government to actually help end the suffering that is going on in mental health and addiction. And opioid, everyone that I know can tell you a story about the opioid epidemic in the United States. It's not as prevalent, I think, in Europe, but it is definitely a major issue in the United States. And the FDA put some incentives in place on how the endpoints upon which we can do a clinical trial. And also they've put in incentives for breakthrough therapy designation. So for us, we're really focused on 18MC, our ibogaine derivative, in order to fast track that through the FDA, because we think it solves a problem that society really needs. And I think one of the biggest topics here should be how do we get there most efficiently and how quickly. And I personally believe, and I think Christian would agree with me, is that the FDA is probably the most efficient way to get federally legal psychedelic medicines to patients in the quickest time frame. Literally that could happen in 2 to 3 years. And I think that should be ultimately our focus. That is where the capital and the resources should be put, so that people that are suffering don't have to anymore. And I'm not saying that, psychedelics or just the medicines that Christian and my companies are working for are going to be the panacea for all suffering. I think that's something that the cannabis industry did not do very well. They advocated sometimes cannabis could be a panacea, and CBD is a panacea. I mean, my grandfather, for example, gives my grandmother in the nursing home CBD for her Alzheimer's. I mean, to me that's unfair. And I think what we should really be focusing on is bringing the data. ATAI and MindMed should focus on bringing the data to the public to make a decision. And there are laws on how you do that in the United States, and there are laws on how you do that in the European Union and globally. And I think we should follow those laws.
Totally agree. No, I mean, unfortunately, our mind and our body are incredibly complex. So there will never be one drug fits all. By the way, again, this is why these drugs have to be medical drugs, because you have to talk to your doctor, see any drugs has side effects. Yeah, I mean, thanks God, actually, like most psychedelics have little side effects, but still you should talk to somebody before who knows you, your doctor. Yeah, again, and then you have to, I'm repeating myself, but like, yeah, there is not one fits all, and there will be hopefully, as Jared said, many new mental health drugs coming. Simplified, I think the old ones are not that good, but there might be still people who still will take the old ones for various reasons. We want to give people and the doctors as many options as possible.
Seth, maybe jump in here and talk about some of the complexities or uncertainties in this. And as an investor, is this too risky? Has cannabis already given us a path to make an understanding of how to make this happen? What are your thoughts?
Well, someone asked in the questions sort of what mistakes did the cannabis industry make that we could learn from? And I think, at least in the U.S., one of the interesting challenges is that we have a state level sort of regulatory infrastructure, and then we have the federal infrastructure. And I don't know that it was a mistake, because I don't know that the feds were ready to do anything, and they still seem to not be. But and this is why I brought up this question about psychedelics for PTSD and treating other sort of more nationally understood and frankly kind of bipartisan in the U.S. Issues, because I think that if it is possible to get some national regulatory framework in place, I think that would be much preferable. And the issue with getting state level regulatory frameworks in place is what we saw in cannabis, which is that it's legal sort of in some places, in some ways, and that presented some real problems, particularly in the U.S. around access to banking and other systems. That we're just starting to solve right now, but that really were big issues for the business or for the industry in the initial probably 5 or 6 years as it rolled out. And Colorado was very, very early in that. So we were amongst the earliest states to legalize first for medicinal and then ultimately for recreational on the cannabis side. And so that prevented growth of the industry. And I think one of the challenges that resulted in is that funding came from essentially hobbyists, right? People that were enthusiasts around cannabis and had some money. But there wasn't sort of follow-on capital available to really scale up those businesses, and that presented meaningful challenges. And we're just starting to see, and again, we're 10 years effectively into the partial legalization of cannabis. So, those are things to be careful about on the psychedelic side, because if we end up with this sort of patchwork regulatory framework, and in particular, if the federal framework is behind state framework, access to banking and other just basic infrastructure isn't going to be available. And it will be much harder for institutional investors, larger pools of capital to invest in these types of businesses. And at some point, that's helpful, even if it's not about the science, it's not about the efficacy of the drugs. It at some point it's just about being able to scale and produce on a larger, for a larger mass market.
But chipping in there, like that's the point. Like, so thankfully at the moment we're not going that way, because making it a medical product, we don't even have all that federal state thing what you have in America. Because if some drug is approved as a drug, again, we're not talking about free sellable mushrooms on the street, then it is approved everywhere. It's in America and even other countries who follow the FDA, and in Europe you have the EMA. So it's a completely, thanks God, and I totally agree on all, and this was also a question on all sort of the volatility and issues the cannabis industry had. But at the moment, or there is no other way, because you cannot go the sort of growing farming way with psychedelics, because they are illegal substances. And the only way, again, and even there was a question on the side that I see that there is, so even in the countries, again, don't forget, people mixed it up. Even the states who put it on the ballots for decriminalization, this does not mean that it can be sold. Yeah, it's just that you're not going to jail if you grow it for yourself and they find it in your car. Yeah, which I think is the right thing. Yeah, but it doesn't mean it is a business out of that. Yeah, so we are on the other end of the spectrum. It's a medical drug, purely used. Yeah, even not on prescription, by the way. So again, within the group of medical drugs, you have several categories from prescription drug. And these drugs will be bound to hospitals and practitioners, because again, I repeat myself, but it's so important if somebody goes out and thinks, oh, Christian may be excited about mushrooms, like you have to do it with a therapist, yeah, or a shaman in a country where it's legal. But it is a drug which is meant to be a trip, literally, with somebody.
We just brought up an interesting thought there for me, which was you said shaman. So these are in many places considered to be divine molecules and plants. And talk to me a little bit about the for-profit, non-profit kind of debate that's going on right now.
So apparently it's a huge debate, because I love it, because I think it's so absurd. Yeah, and I love the debate because it's sort of where do I start? Meaning it is actually a non-debate, because the people who take the debate, they come from the wrong perspective. And by the way, just to show the framework, like there are companies I highly regard and actually support, like MAPS, yeah, who are non-profits, and MAPS is in the timeline is the leading one, because they developing and bringing MDMA to the market as a product, yeah, and actually MDMA is in phase 3. First drug on the market will most likely be MDMA, and I would be very happy, literally, for that. Yeah, and they are non-profit. Yeah, so and ATAI and MindMed are for-profit. Yeah, so, and I know that there are some people in sort of the community, whatever it means, to pitch these two models against each other. So, oh, is this the right way, or is this the right way? And what they actually completely forget, that it's completely irrelevant, because the only thing we should care, and by the way, we do care, like all the players, yeah, you could even pitch, say, oh, Christian against JR, because they're both a company, and a company always is in competition. No, it's all what JR said. It's all about, there are hundreds of millions, and most likely billions of people who have a need in several of these substances, yeah. And the only thing which is important is that we make these things available, meaning that we are successful in our own way, in our own right, yeah, bringing these drugs to those people who need it, yeah. So, and that costs money, yeah, and that costs, by the way, this costs, people are always amazed about that, and we can discuss if that's right and if we should reform the FDA, and I'm totally up for that discussion. But we are, this is hundreds of millions of dollars, hundreds per single drug. So ATAI, in my company, is at the moment developing 7 mental health drugs. That means, yeah, over the course, yeah, I need more than $1 billion, yeah, to bring these drugs to the market. It's just
Yeah, interesting. So I think you're going to join us back in a second, I'm sure, as your feed kind of comes back in. But so let me hit on that, which is, there's a question that showed up, which was, if really what we're doing is building a startup in the medical pharma world, how do you battle big pharma? How do you take that on? And JR, are you guys collaborating on that? How does that work?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good question, and I think battle is probably the wrong word. Look, pharma companies have lots of money; they have lots of capital to deploy, and Christian just made a very good point. Each specific drug can cost in the tens of millions to to 100 million plus to develop and bring to market. Those are no small numbers, right? What we will need to do is raise institutional capital, and we will need funding sources. We've done a good job of getting public so that we can access institutional capital and in pension funds and folks that will invest into us. But also, pharmaceutical companies will be a big investor in this space, and they are starting to take notice. There have already, I'm sure that ATAI and MindMed as well have already had discussions with pharmaceutical companies. I think what we need to do is figure out a way that we can actually reform how we treat mental health in America and globally, and we can do that by partnering with pharmaceutical companies. We can be part of the change and let them realize that, look, there are additional ways to treat mental health. And so, yeah, I think we have to partner. down the line. Because what's most important, and I think Christian really has made this point as well, is access. And we can talk about nonprofit versus for-profit, but at the end of the day, there are millions, if not potentially, a billion people that have mental health issues globally after this whole COVID-19 thing shakes out. And we need to look at the minority populations that might not have the benefits of the four of us sitting on this call. How are they going to get access? These are the real problems to be solving, not necessarily for-profit versus nonprofit.
Yeah, but I think I'm back, right? I fell out. Am I back?
You're back.
Yeah, so to finish the point, but not repetitive, but it is where I broke off was that it's impossible to raise that money. Yeah, meaning I see it how MAPS actually, how Rick Doblin needs to sort of work on raising the money, and he shouldn't need to, by the way, because it's an amazing drug which should be at the market. Yeah. So again, my point is there is zero competition between the non-profit and the for-profit model because we want the same. We access different pools of money, and that's a good thing because the more money we all can pull into this industry together, the more drugs will be quicker at people who need it.
So correct me if my history catch-up was wrong, but psychedelics came into pretty high research in the 60s. And then we were a little earlier than that, I guess, even. But in the 60s is when it really kind of, Nixon kind of kiboshed it with the war on drugs piece. And we kind of fell into this decade, if not more, of quiet zone. What's different this time? And how is that not going to repeat itself?
Well, I think if you look at the guy behind me, Albert Hofmann, who's the inventor of LSD, I mean, he really kicked off this modern psychedelic renaissance, right? That led to the 1960s. I mean, he ultimately was part of Sandoz Laboratories, which is a pharmaceutical company now part of Novartis. MDMA as well was invented inside of Merck, another pharmaceutical company in Germany. This
it's always the Germans
and the Swiss.
True.
But I think as we look at the past and look to the future, I think we don't want to turn what is now another renaissance in this space, more of a medical renaissance, into an apocalypse. And I think we need to do this diligently. I think we need to do it prudently, and I think we need to take a very traditional approach on developing these untraditional substances. I mean, that is undeniable. This needs to happen, and we'll do that. And I think one other thing that a lot of people sort of forget is that this is the original patent for LSD, not the original one. It's signed by Hofmann. In order to enable progress and innovation, you need a good patent system, and you need institutional capital that is going to invest into these businesses to have a large impact. I mean, this stuff costs significant capital, right? And so investors are not going to do that unless they have IP protection. And so as companies, we need to focus on that innovation.
I think the other thing I'd add to that is we need to have a little bit of patience, right? If we're going to go the regulated medicine route, then we need to be patient about how long it's going to take to actually get those, do the drug trials and get approvals. And I think that's a different type of business.
And if you look back in the history, again, repeating like myself, is like, if you look at what Timothy Leary did, I think with super good intentions, but that's exactly what we should all avoid. He was sort of had a personal experience with the drugs, but he pitched it as an antithesis to society. I mean, this was like tune out of society, do something else. And I think this is wrong because this should be a part of society. There is no conflict. There is no sort of antithesis, whatever. Because I'm a very harmony-seeking person. But it's never good to create conflict, especially where is none. And my view is psychedelics should be very normally, actually. We should also a little bit lose almost that sort of who this is so special. Again, doesn't mean, by the way, again, I'm personally very spiritual, that not the individual person can have a very spiritual experience with it. But we should not enforce, especially if you have a spiritual experience, you shouldn't try to enforce that on others, that view. You should offer it sort of neutrally. And it should be part of society.
You guys are all partnering up, right? If everyone's partnering up in the space, nonprofit companies, big pharma.
We do.
then who's the biggest antagonist? Who's the person that's saying, who's the antagonist here?
This is the weird thing. I think it's the following problem. I think, again, hopefully I'm becoming not too philosophical or religious or whatever. Unfortunately, if you look at how religions were started, you normally have a very positive message. But then every religious experience has the grain in it that you believe that you are better than others because you found it. You found enlightenment. You know it better, and now you are better because you know better. That is, unfortunately, the course a lot of religious zealots and extremists took. And the sad truth is that the psychedelic industry or community with all the spirituality does have its religious extremists. And I think it's equally wrong, and I equally despise it, these people, then I despise every single religious extremist in Christianity, in Islam, or in any other religion. So, and we have that as well. So if you want to have an antagonist, it's unfortunate, it's a minority, but as in any extremist situation, if you look at Islam, if you look at Christianity, even Buddhists, they have extremists, violent Buddhists. These people have a talent for making themselves heard. It's actually a very sad story because I think it's a psychological problem. But we shouldn't actually even spend so much time with it because that's a fraction and it was never relevant in history. Now, in history, it was relevant. It created a lot of trouble. But I don't think it's relevant now.
Yeah, I think the biggest antagonist in this space is stigma. It is misunderstanding, misconception. We need to educate people and inform them and present them data on why these medicines can work. And until we have the data, done in a legal manner that is acceptable by our societies and our governments, will that, really have, I think, an impact on totally destigmatizing these substances. I think Michael Pollan's book did a good job to at least outline the history. But one of the major things is when you involve politics and religion in a discussion, that's usually when the discussion becomes manic, divided, and not focused on a great outcome. I think our current predicament, right now, and in globally around COVID, politics are getting involved, and that's getting in the way of treating people. And so I think as a company and personally, I'm going to stay as far away from the politics and the religion on these substances. I think that is the best path forward, because otherwise you alienate people. And what we need is cohesion, and we need unity, because there are people suffering, and those people matter far more to me, and that mission matters far more to me than the politics of the space. And so we'll be focusing on getting the. You
hit on data, and I'm an advisor for one of the sponsoring companies here, Unlimited Sciences, who's got a partnership with Johns Hopkins. They're launching a whole research, I think, in about a month to do just that, gather data. And you've collected, and you've partnered with a couple of universities as well. Is that the ingoing kind of approach? Is to partner with research institutions to gather the data, maybe try to get data from the wild, try to get it from truly, set and setting? Or tell me about the approach there.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think as a business, you want to focus on having as much data as possible, especially when you're dealing with the FDA. The more data you have, the more that you can point to, and the more that you own, it's important. And so we did a collaboration with the University Hospital Basel and Dr. Matthias Lichty, who is based in Basel, which is also the birthplace of LSD. It's where Albert invented LSD. So I think that was extremely interesting, and we got 10 years of studies and data on LSD, and we'll be looking to further his research. He's also helping us. We are announced yesterday starting a phase 2A study for microdosing of LSD for adult ADHD. We are going to be starting that both in the Netherlands and hopefully in Switzerland as well. But we're collaborating with Maastricht University, Dr. Kim Kupers, who is one of the sort of leading thought leaders on microdosing. And I think we've talked a lot about hallucinogenic substances, and I think there's a large void in understanding the data that, look, there's clear benefit to a hallucinogenic experience, but these substances have not been properly researched since 1970, and there's been prohibition on really researchers involving that. They got by on shoestrings. So now companies like Christian and I can provide academics and other entrepreneurs in the space the capital that they need to really, create innovation around these substances. I mean, there are ways to create next generation psychedelics, and that was what MindMed is going to be focused on.
Seth, does this rhyme with any of the industries that you guys have really kind of brought to market?
Well, I mean, it's different in the sense that we don't play in biosciences at all, so we haven't invested in any business that's had to go through a FDA style approval process. But I think that if you sort of step back from that, this larger question of like, how do you gain more broad acceptance? I think it's a really good question for those of us that care about the industry to be thinking about, right? So it's not just here are the steps that you need to take to get something approved. I think it's also this approval and adoption in particular will be accelerated with people accepting it. And I think the question is, how can you find use cases for ailments that are common, that people know someone who has an ailment, right? If it's like the more fringe it is and the more fringe the use case it is, the harder it's going to be for people just in general in the middle of Europe or the middle of the US to feel like they have any real understanding of how or why this might be used. And so the closer, and we've seen this in other markets all over the place, like the closer you are to someone that has the challenge or the problem and then has used, in this case, microdosing of psychedelics to address that challenge, the higher the likelihood that you gain widespread acceptance. And so I do think that from that perspective, what these guys are talking about makes a lot of sense, because you want to find those ailments that are common enough that one, that the market's large, of course, and then two, that it will resonate with people because everyone knows someone who has struggled with this challenge or that challenge, right? And so I think that that's the way to get it more mainstream, and I think that'll significantly accelerate its adoption. And we saw that, by the way, in the cannabis market. I mean, ironically, it was more the CBD side of cannabis than the THC side, but the benefits around seizure and other things that led people to like go to their state legislators and lobby for the legalization early on before we separated those two paths here. Those were the stories that stood out. That's what got on local news, and that's what people resonated with. It was the mom, if you will, in the example I'm thinking of, talking about an epileptic child and the benefits. And I think that we need those moments in this industry in order to gain that kind of widespread acceptance.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, it's the humanity, it's the human story, it's the mom story, but and then it was also the partnership between a nonprofit like Realm of Caring with a for-profit company. So great point. Question. So I wrote down, when I was doing my research, I kind of wrote down some of the areas that you guys are focused on problem solving right now. What am I missing? I have kind of this aging process where there's pain and also end of life scenarios. And so this kind of anxiety and depression around that is one area. Another area I had was just anxiety and depression in general. So you mentioned before depression that's no longer can be treated with typical things. PTSD, obviously we're seeing a huge growth in concern around that, especially with our armed forces. And then you just mentioned ADHD. These all seem to play into the mental health realm. Yeah. What am I missing?
Well, look, I think if you look at the comorbidity of different diseases and illnesses in mental health, they aren't, you can't just treat. Christian made a good point. It's like, with cancer, you can treat the cancer and, hopefully it goes away. With mental health, I think there's this comorbidity issue where, someone that has an addiction most likely is also depressed. And so, with my own personal experience, if I sort of figure out why my mental health deteriorated over many years was, when I was 13 years old, my parents brought me to a psychiatrist's office and sent me home with a bottle of Ritalin, right? I mean, that's a stimulant-based medicine that turned into Adderall and Concerta and every other crazy drug that there is out there. And so when I look at ADHD, which is what I have, technically defined, we're already giving people these harmful substances in America, right? So like this is a huge issue. Like we're giving kids stimulants. We are giving kids a microdose of methamphetamine, more or less the equivalent. That to me doesn't make sense. And so when I talk to parents about, hey, they also have ADHD, would you consider microdosing LSD? Is that something that I get asked a lot? They're like, look, whatever is going to solve the outcome, whatever is going to solve the problem, I am interested in doing. And I think my generation has already demonstrated that. That's how really where this microdosing craze came out of. It came out of Silicon Valley. James Fadiman's book, Psychedelic Explorer's Guide, really kind of became folklore for microdosing. And there's clearly a benefit. There's enough anecdotal evidence out there. It's very rare that you go into these drug trials where your anecdotal phase 1 and phase 2 is done at such high scale, right? I mean, that's such a very much de-risk proposition for both of our companies. Going into these drug trials, that there is some inkling that this is potentially going to work. You don't know certainty how your trial is going to what the outcome is going to be there. But that's, to me, it's a very, as an entrepreneur, that's a very de-risk proposition that you have all that evidence out there. Now, we can't use it for the FDA, though they would laugh us out of the room if we brought them a Reddit profile or a trip report or, a microdosing log. But we can do the real rigorous science and do the phase 2A microdosing trial, and we can eventually do phase 3s, and we will get to approvals on some of these substances. And
so explore with me a little bit, because it's interesting. I'm seeing this wave. What are some of the other businesses and industries that will be able to ride that wave? One, I think we mentioned before, kind of VR, AR, so kind of a guided set and setting via software. What are some of the other industries that you've seen, and maybe Seth, you've seen this in other areas, where all of a sudden a lot of other companies can come up and support or kind of ride that industry?
The obvious one is clinics. Again, they will be bound to clinics. So actually, always one of the questions I get a lot is like, will we make psychiatrists and therapists, whatever, out of work? It's the opposite. We need more of them. Yeah. And I think they will be happier as well, because they're gonna make a bigger impact. I think at the moment, if you talk to psychiatrists and therapists, they're very frustrated because they don't have the tools. They know some of them actually know still from the 60s that these tools were available and they were taken away from them. Yeah, so we're gonna make them more effective. Yeah, they're gonna be happier because they want to help their patients. So it will be a way bigger sort of business than it is now. Yeah. So that's one. Clinic models, as you said, during the trip you might be able to. Music is a very important thing. Visuals, VR, as you said. And after the trip, you might want to have an app, because one of these things psychedelics do, they can also help you they can actually help dissolve addiction, but on the other side, they can help you form positive habits. Yeah, so these can be small things like habit reminders. This can be chat apps with a therapist. Meaning you can perfectly use technology for pre and post integration. And maybe one point where you said like different illnesses, different drugs. I think what ultimately the underlying case for various mental health issues is often the same, which is some sort of trauma, which we may be not aware of. And how a lot of psychedelics work on is that they help you dissolving that trauma, that pain, which sort of caused then maybe an anxiety, maybe depression, maybe PTSD. So this is why different ways, but sort of they all tackling in a certain way the same underlying problem.
Christian and JR, I'm curious if you guys have a thought on one of the challenges about going after depression and anxiety, for example, are that there's a sort of an embedded industrial complex, if you will, right, of medicines that really are not efficacious, right? I mean, it's actually interesting if you see this, I'm sure you guys are all familiar with it, but the science is that most of the drugs that are used to combat mental health and depression don't actually really work. And it's an open debate about whether even the systems and the pathways that they go after are even relevant, right? And it's interesting sidetrack, which we won't get all the way down. But the reality is that if you're bringing out drugs that are going after those same clinical, the same same challenges, depression and anxiety, that you're going against huge embedded large pharmaceutical companies. Any thoughts on that and some of the challenges of, obviously that's separate from the FDA process and the approval processes, but it's still relevant, right? Because there is a lot of embedded spending that is, where their drugs are still under patent and they have a lot at stake if it turns out that, these drugs either work better, or frankly, if it just comes to light that the existing drugs don't work at all, which is why they've managed to bury all this science and research that suggests that they don't.
Yeah. So I have a more optimistic or constructive view on the pharma industry. I know it's always easy to say, oh, there is sort of evil pharma and good sort of biotech startups. And my view on pharma is they're not evil because they sort of, there is not intention to be evil. So a lot of things which are happening, which might not be good or which might be improvable, are sort of happening as sort of rather as default, and not to explain it right, of the situation, but there is not an evil intention. And interesting because what you're describing happens in a lot of other sort of illnesses as well. Like there can be a better cancer drug tomorrow, there can be a better antiviral drug. So pharma companies are not the ones, I have not experienced them, who are actively plotting and saying, we don't want that. They actually what also JR already said, they actively sort of machines who, if you look back in the history of pharma, someone were told, rightly so, by investment banks, look, you are not good at innovation. So innovation, drug development within pharma companies is a multiple times more expensive than if biotech companies do it. So somewhere in these pharma companies said, well, we might not be good at innovation, but we are good distribution machines. And we buy in innovation. So it's not that they try to avoid innovation. The pharma industry is one of the most grateful M&A machines. Or you partner, they don't need to buy anything, they can partner with you, whatever. So I don't see pharma as the evil antagonist. As I said, I don't think anybody should be an antagonist. So, but like as partners, who might give us their distribution, because don't forget, if JR and I are successful, we still need to get those drugs once approved to the patients. We need to talk to the doctors. This is like positively said. This is maybe whole industries when you ask us which new businesses can be there. But it's worthwhile to partner with somebody who has the access. So we got just at Compass, we got an investment from pharma company Otsuka. They are big in mental health, with traditional stuff. They are very positive on that. Otherwise, they wouldn't have invested, And they sort of, it's not their fault that these drugs are not there. You can claim, which is good for us.
I'm saying something a little bit different, Christian, which is, I understand that obviously pharma as a distribution methodology they have all the existing systems. I don't know that I share, obviously, I think at some level, pharma exists to benefit humans and create drugs that work. On another level, they are there to sell drugs, right? So all of the serotonin class drugs that don't work and have been proven over and over again as non-efficacious, and with the long and very well documented history of pharma companies burying studies that don't show that they're effective, I don't know that I have quite the rosy view that you have on it, but I guess what I'm asking is, serotonin enhancing drugs is a, $10 billion, $50 billion industry. Are they going to push back against new drug development that threatens that franchise? No,
as I said, they'd rather partnering. We have very good talks. They're not pushing back. I also don't think they can, it's more like I have a more constructive view.
I think this is out in the open, right? If they push back on it, it's very much in the open. Christian and I are both very vocal figures in this space, and I think the bigger threat to this industry is not necessarily the pharmaceutical industry. I think they're going to be partners, and I think they're going to help ultimately deploy these medicines down the line. I think the biggest threat is stigma, and we need to get over the stigma. If we can get over the stigma and present the data, we are going to be in a much better place on these medicines.
All right, guys, I really appreciate this. We got to be wrapping up here in just a couple minutes. So I'd love, my kind of final question for each of you is that if this thing, have we already hit the tipping point? Or what is the tipping point signal, in your opinion, that this is going to become mainstream, that it's going to follow down the process you just outlined, which is get FDA approval, become a drug, go through. What is the tipping point that you're looking for or you're trying to create right now with your partners in the industry?
When Gwyneth Paltrow was shrooming on TV, that was definitely the tipping point. so we're way past it. And by the way, somebody told me there is now the new seasons of Billions.
Yeah.
Psychedelic investor. So we way past. It's actually, and I'm not joking, I think it's going too fast a little bit because, again, I guess JR said science. Yeah, so that's, we need actually to sort of curb back and
science. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, the tipping point for me is always my aunt at Thanksgiving. And when she starts talking about something, it's usually about to get really big. I remember her talking about Facebook, about gluten-free, about Uber. And last year, she started talking about Michael Pollan's book and psychedelics. And so to me, when you can start having these as dinner room conversations, that is the tipping point. And that is when real change ultimately will happen because you will have the support of people that are in need of new solutions.
Yeah, I wanted to share this before. This was a couple weeks ago. This is now up and running, but everyone who had an iPhone got this News Plus alert specifically about this. So maybe we have hit that. Seth, what's your thoughts?
Well, I think what JR just said is right. Like it's when you start hearing it from parts of society that aren't deep into this and really thinking about it. I think we're still a little ways from being there, right? I don't think that sort of mainstream America is talking a lot, or mainstream Europe is talking a lot about the use of microdosing and psychedelics. And I think if you ask most people, the average person on the street, what does microdosing mean? I don't know that they actually understand what that means yet. So that's not necessarily a bad thing, but I think we've got a little ways to go before we're really there.
Yeah, we definitely don't at the peak.
Well, hey, listen, we are at our time.
Microdose. Oh, sorry. I was thinking it's time for my microdose.
Oh, sorry, I have to plug back in, but I just say, you might say we're not at like the mainstream Americans not talking about it. This is Gwyneth Paltrow. This is the etiquette of LSD. Town and Country took me to Switzerland. They went and looked at, Albert Hofmann's memorial. This is conversation. This is real. People are talking about it. I mean, we're headed in the right direction.
I think we're headed in the right direction. I don't think I don't think it's quite as mainstream. It's one of those challenges, right? When you're in this group and everyone is talking about it. So it seems like it's everywhere, but I don't think it's quite there, right? Gwyneth aside.
This has been awesome.
Who is, by the way, awesome. I love Gwyneth Paltrow.
Yeah, of course. Last thoughts. I'll let you guys each kind of close it up with whatever you kind of take away here, especially from a business perspective.
Sorry, say again?
This is going to be last thoughts. So let's go around the horn, specifically from like an industry and a business perspective, the people listening, thinking about this industry, how to be involved, how to mitigate risk, how to invest.
Well, I'm not giving you, it's so complicated to give investment advice. Yeah, I would rather tell everybody, I know we talked about business all the time, but I think psychedelics are a wonderful way to get to know yourself better. Meaning my message would be investing is one thing, you want to get stocks to know better, but get to know yourself. Yeah. And I think psychedelics can be an amazing way to sort of realize what you want in life, what makes you happy, what you should avoid. Yeah, which sounds a little bit like fluffy what I'm saying, but I really think, because I think deeply I've been always happy, and I think happiness is sort of the ultimate everybody should be happy. So that should be and not in a giggly way, sort of in these sort of continuous ways. So we talked a lot, obviously, about really the absence of happiness in the way of depression. But I think that's maybe as a last point. Shockingly, a lot of people I know, when I talk to them about the topic, would say, well, I'm not depressed, so I have not a negative feeling, but I'm not also happy either. So if I count the number of people who are either depressed or not happy, I come up to 70, 80, 90% of humanity. But I think we should be happy, deeply happy every day, because life is fucking awesome. Yeah. And so everybody should grab Michael Pollan's book, which I think is an awesome book. I think it's a great start into the topic, and make himself.
And also watch your movie, right? The Hector movie.
Yes, I would be very happy if you watch it. We all have time on Netflix. I produced the movie Hector and the Search for Happiness. It's years ago, so it was actually because the theme of happiness always was very important for me, because for whatever reason, I was always happy. That doesn't mean, by the way, you not to have a bad day. Yeah, but like true happiness is sort of, as we describe it in the movie, Christopher Plummer says it in his role, like it's the sense, even if you have a bad day, that you wake up in the morning and go to bed, and still, everything is all right. You are all right. Like you're in the right place. It's very like, yeah, Zen-like. Yeah. And again, unfortunately, at this time, I didn't know about psychedelic. Otherwise, they would be in the movie. But I think the movie gives you a little bit of a glimpse of sort of simple stuff, how you can sort of put your life. I think a lot of people could be, the beauty and the hard thing about being happy is that it's so easy. Yeah, so it's not complicated, but because it's so easy, people, either they don't dare to. What I realized, a lot of people don't dare to have it because we tell ourselves, oh, I don't know, I have to do this. And anyway, so it's a long topic, but I think, Hector and the Search for Happiness is great. I think Michael Pollan's book is great. I'm a big fan of Deepak Chopra, by the way. I think Deepak Chopra, without mentioning it, is a very psychedelic takeaway. So I could underwrite every single sentence and book he wrote with the psychedelics experience. So I think that's a good thing. So don't think about investing too much. Think about your happiness.
Seth, final thoughts?
Well, I guess if we're sharing books, I thought Lost Connections from Johann Hari was really good. And it talks, actually, I think it's highly relevant now because it happens to touch on psychedelics, by the way, and some of the really early studies on it. But it talks a lot about sort of the failure of SSRIs, some of the things I was referring to earlier, but more relevant, and I think it's something I've been thinking about a lot, maybe because I only read it maybe, 6 months ago, and then all of a sudden we're in this like COVID, totally unconnected, or at least unmeaningfully connected period that we need to be really careful about just sort of isolation and kind of what problems that leads to. I think we are headed to a mental health crisis around the world because of the need to social distance. So I would say that. And the other thing I'd leave you with is that I think if the idea with microdosing and psychedelics is to go down the sort of drug FDA regulated path, then we shouldn't analogize it to cannabis, because I think that was a totally different way of approaching market adoption and market acceptance. I think it has its advantages, but it also was messy. And we're still dealing with sort of multiple tiers of some of the regulatory frameworks that I referred to earlier. So we shouldn't compare the two if the plan is to go the clinical trial FDA approval route. And so I think it's so tempting because they're drugs, right? Recreational drugs. I think it's so tempting to be like, well, what can we learn from the cannabis market? And that's still probably a relevant question, but they're not the same thing, especially if we're going about it in a really different way.
Thank you. JR.
I'm going to keep it short and sweet. I think we need to stop talking as much about the substances, more about the outcomes. We tend to talk about LSD, MDMA, psilocybin. What we really need to be focused on is what are the potential outcomes of these medicines and how do we get there? I think there's a clear path with the FDA to do that. But that is our mission. That is MindMed's focus. We're going to focus on how we create outcomes for our patients, and we're going to obsess over that.
Sounds like you're looking for a renaissance, not an apocalypse.
Sure. I would very much hope so, because I think the cards are stacked against us right now in terms of this isolation and what impact this is going to have on our mental health and addiction. And so we need to keep pushing forward. This is important work.
Well, all three of you, thank you very, very much. Thank you to Boulder Startup Week, Unlimited Sciences, to Maya for your time and your knowledge and your insights. I really appreciate you taking the time. So thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.